Hey everyone, it's Jeff Young, kinesiologist. Every system and related field of study, whether it's math or physics or chemistry, language, medicine, nutrition, and in this case, exercise, are governed by laws. And the laws that govern systems serve as the foundation of the system, or are the first principles of the system, which is why in philosophy it's known as foundationalism. So, to better understand a system and any claims made within it, it's critical that you understand the first principles of the system or the laws that govern it. Because when you understand the first principles of a system, you'll have working knowledge of how that system operates. And probably just as importantly, it's going to allow you to easily be able to discern when a claim made within that system is true or false. Because if someone makes a claim and it conflicts with the laws or principles that govern the system, it's not the laws or the principles that are false, it's the claim that's false. And conversely, if the claim corresponds with the laws that govern a system, then you can know that the claim is true. And that's the purpose of this video and the next one. This one is part 1 and the next one is part 2 of the first principles or the laws that govern exercise. So I've grouped these laws into categories to make them a little bit easier to understand. And I'm also including some real world examples to give them more clarity. I really hope you'll take the time to learn these, look them up, learn more about them, and get them ingrained into your head, because it's really going to help with not only your own exercise program, but also to keep from being duped by all the fads, myths, and gimmicks that permeate the fitness industry, and especially in this age of technology and social media, where you have platforms that are inundated with supposed experts who aren't experts at all. So with all that said, let's jump into part 1. Okay, so I've purposely set up this chart and grouped the principles into categories just to make it easier for the viewer to understand and for me to explain. So in this chart, under the category of variation, or in other words, the importance of variety, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 principles. So I'll go through them real quickly. The first is Seyle's general adaptation syndrome. And basically, this principle states that an organism such as the human body goes through 3 stages when it's hit with a stress. The first stage is known as shock or alarm, where the stress is new to the body, it is a threat to the integrity of the body, it disrupts the homeostasis or the body's balance. And during this stage, especially in resistance training, but it can apply to other forms of exercise as well, such as aerobic and even flexibility. This is where you're going to feel the most soreness, delayed onset muscle soreness over the course of typically the next 24 to 48 hours. And performance also typically decreases as well. Depending on the person's fitness level, this stage can last anywhere from a couple weeks to several months. The more deconditioned the person is, the longer they will be within this stage, because the greater your fitness level, the quicker your body adapts and moves to stage 2, which is known as resistance or adaptation. So now the stress is no longer a shock to the body. It recognizes the stress, is resisting it, and adapting to it. So this is the phase where your fitness level is improving. As long as you're not sabotaging things with your diet, your health is improving along with it. And this is the stage that you want to be in and spend the most time in. Unfortunately, this stage doesn't last forever. It also lasts for anywhere from a couple weeks to several months. Once again, depending on the fitness level of the person, the more fit they are, the more quickly they'll move into stage 3. And stage 3 is known as plateau or staleness, where basically what's happening is your body has adapted to the stress. There's nothing left to adapt to. And unless you change the stress on the body, there's a risk of overtraining, but things will definitely get stale. Your central nervous system will no longer be challenged to progress or adapt, which is something that you'll see in a principle that I'll describe later. And basically, this principle shows that you can't continue to do the same thing over and over again and expect to continue to see results. The problem is that many people go to the gym, and that's exactly what they do. Creatures of habit tend to do the same exercises in the same order and a lot of times even the same repetition range or intensity. And once again, what happens is the central nervous system gets stale and is no longer challenged to adapt. So that's the reason why I have this principle under the umbrella or category of variation, because it expresses the need to vary things like frequency, volume, and intensity. And it's also the principle that the concept of periodization was founded upon, which is something I'll talk about in another video. The next principle is called the principle of variation. And in today's world of technology and social media, too many people are equating that to this supposed need to insert the latest and coolest exercise into the program. While that is part of the principle of variation, the truth is it relates much more to the need to vary frequency, volume, sets, repetitions, loads, rest periods, order of exercise, and exercise tempo. So the principle of variation is a lot more about those variables and ebbing and flowing and varying them, which once again I'll explain in another video when I talk about periodization in more detail. It has much less to do with a need to continually insert new exercises into the program. Exercise selection should still revolve around primary exercises, and there should be a method to the madness when inserting assistance exercises. The next principle is called the principle of individualization, which is primarily speaking about the need to account for the individual's unique capacity for and response to training. So yes, we do need to individualize training programs, but this is mainly based on age and their current level of fitness, exercise history, and levels of motivation and confidence. But the truth is, and this is also something I'll cover in more detail in another video, there are a lot more similarities to program design, especially with resistance training, than there are differences. Differences do include frequency and how that's going to affect corresponding program design in the sense of total body versus split routine. And then also things like initial loads, the individual's available range of motion based on any potential either joint pain or movement restrictions. And there's a few other examples which I'll cover later. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's a little bit of a myth that we need to individualize the person's program in the sense of exercise selection, because most people, unless they have some sort of limitations such as joint pain, most people should still be performing some version of a squat, one or more versions of deadlifts, lunges if they can, and push, pull, and press variations. But once again, I'll go over this in much more detail in my video about how to design a periodized program. Next on the list is the principle of diminishing returns. As hopefully you're starting to see, and will continue to see, these principles are closely related to each other. So some of them say almost the same thing. And in the case of diminishing returns, it's just saying that monotonous training leads to stagnation. So there's a need for variety, and we don't want to do the same thing over and over again. And then last, under the umbrella of variation, are Wolff's and Davis laws, which are two laws in the field of sports medicine. Wolff's law relates to bone, and Davis' law relates to muscle, but they both say basically the same thing, and that's that bone and muscle adapt specifically to the load placed upon it and the angle of the load. So we need variation in loads. It can't always be 10 repetitions per set with the same or very similar loads session after session, nor can it be the same angles. And what I mean by that is, for instance, in squats, you want to vary your foot position, even if it's just a little bit. And the same goes with deadlifts, such as sumo versus conventional deadlift, because foot variation is going to slightly change what's going on at the hips and the knees, the muscle groups involved in the exercise, and it's going to place slightly different stressors on the bone and the muscle and ultimately optimize the adaptations. So moving on, the next category is progression, and there's two very related principles under that umbrella. The principle of progression and the principle of overload. And many times in the world of fitness or strength and conditioning, we just combine these and call it progressive overload. But there is just a little bit of a difference. The principle of progression is talking about modifying exercise program over time by progressing in frequency, volume, or duration. Volume, as an example, can relate to how many sets an individual is performing per session with strength training, or how many sets they're performing for a muscle group in the scope of a week. And while duration can relate to strength training as well, such as the duration of a plank, more often when we speak about duration, it's referring to aerobic exercise. But we also want to progress in intensity or from a simple to a more complex exercise. And then closely related, the principle of overload is stating that training should slightly exceed what the individual is accustomed to or the previous workout. This is accomplished by increasing sets per exercise or muscle group, varying the repetitions within a set and the corresponding load being used, and or decreasing rest periods in between sets. With aerobic and flexibility training, overload is accomplished by increasing frequency, duration, intensity, or by changing from one mode of exercise to another, such as from running to the elliptical or from the elliptical machine to a bicycle. And lastly, in part 1 of this presentation, the category is effort. And there's two very closely related principles under this umbrella. One is Henneman's size principle of strength, and the other is Henneman's size principle of hypertrophy. Both of these principles can get fairly complex, but simply stated, Henneman's size principle of strength means that as loads increase and therefore the repetitions that you're performing in a set is decreasing, there's an increasing need for the recruitment of additional motor units and their associated muscle fibers, and a corresponding increase in neural drive. In the 1 to 8 repetition range, and assuming that you're loading up with a weight where at the end of the set you are at or within 1 or 2 repetitions of muscle failure, for most individuals, the central nervous system will recruit most or all of the pool of muscle fibers within the muscles that are involved in that exercise right from the beginning of the set. And the reason why is because those loads on an objective continuum are considered very heavy, such as in the 1 to 4 repetition range, or heavy, such as in the 4 to 6 or 4 to 8 repetition range. And simply put, since you're lifting heavy loads in those lower repetition ranges, that's what's going to lead to optimal strength gains. As you increase the repetitions and the corresponding loads become lighter, such as 8 to 12 RM, where the loads are now considered moderate, most people are still going to see gains in strength, but they're not going to be as significant because the loads are lighter. And now moving on to Henneman's size principle of hypertrophy, this principle is basically showing that unlike strength gains, which occurs relatively speaking in a much smaller window, typically the 1 to 12 or 1 to 15 repetition range for most people, gains in lean muscle tissue can occur across a much wider spectrum of repetition ranges, typically the 5 to 30, 35, maybe even 40 repetition range. And while this is a great thing, because it means that you can increase muscle using light and very light loads, one of the problems, at least for most people, is that the lighter the load is, the more important it becomes to take yourself to muscle failure, or once again, a repetition or two shy of muscle failure. And that's going to mean the need to tolerate that burning sensation because of metabolic stress that accumulates during the course of those long sets. And another issue with training with light and very light loads in, say, the 20 to 30 repetition range is that you're not killing two birds with one stone like you are by training in the 5 to 15 repetition range. And what I mean by that is, in the 5 to 15 repetition range, most people are going to see increases in both strength and lean muscle tissue. Whereas once you get above 15 repetitions per set, most people will no longer see an increase in strength, and they'll only see an increase in hypertrophy, and only if they take those sets to at or near muscle failure. So the point is that with the exception of outlier situations, you're just better off spending the majority of your time in approximately the 5 to 15 repetition range, which corresponds with the guidelines of the two governing bodies in exercise science anyway, the American College of Sports Medicine and the National Strength and Conditioning Association. Because within that spectrum of repetition range, you're going to optimize all your adaptations, and especially strength and hypertrophy. So a real quick review. In part 1 of this presentation, I covered 9 foundational principles of exercise and placed them under the umbrella of 3 categories: variation, progression, and effort. And if you look at these as a whole, it's basically saying that when you design a program, it's really important to make sure that you include variety, that you include progression, and that the effort is there in order to progress and see continued gains in fitness and health. And the primary way to accomplish this is by engaging in a periodized program, because by its very nature, a periodized program accounts for all of these principles. So I hope that gave you more insight into some of the laws that govern exercise. And make sure you check out part 2 so that you can learn the rest of them. And then that's going to allow the rest of my videos to make a lot more sense, because everything is going to start piggybacking off of each other. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.